Hello everyone and welcome back to AP Bio with AP Playground. Today we're reviewing Unit 8, Ecology. So, things you need to know for Unit 8. Organisms respond to their environment and behaviors that help each other are going to be favored. Energy flows through trophic levels in ecosystems while matter cycles. We have population growth that is both exponential and logistic, and this is due to density dependent and independent factors. We can measure diversity through Simpson's Diversity Index. We'll be looking at community interactions, biodiversity, and the importance of keystone species, and ending with disruptions to ecosystems due to both human activity and natural events. Let's get started. So we'll begin discussing by response, and organisms respond to their environment through behavioral and physiological changes. So behavioral changes are what an organism does and how it does it, and these behaviors are due to genetic but also environmental factors, and we'll look more at those on the next slide. But physiological changes are going to be changes in the body's form or function, so changes in the body structure or function. One behavior we can look at is taxis and kinesis. So taxis is when there's a certain stimulus or its response to a stimulus in a specific direction, whereas kinesis is going to be response to a stimulus, just movement in a non-specific direction. So in response to the stimulus, taxis is going to say that we're directly moving toward or away from the stimulus, while kinesis is moving in a random direction. And these are behavioral changes. These are changes in what the organism is doing in response to the stimulus, which is going to elicit that change. And phototropism is plants leaning towards sunlight. We can see down here this plant leaning to sunlight in order to maximize the resources it gains from the sunlight. So this is a way that this plant is responding to its environment in order to gain as much solar energy as it can from the sun. And organisms communicate using signals, and when they communicate through signals, there are responses to these signals, and signals are stimuli that changes behavior, and these signals are used to establish dominance, to find food, to establish territory, and ensure reproduction. So this communication happens in order to figure out who is the head of the pack, in order to get the resources needed to survive and reproduce. And signals can include visuals, such as warning colors. We see this poison dart frog. It's got that warning color, that bright red, tells predators do not eat meat. Attraction for mating. If you are a peacock and you've got the prettiest plumes, the largest plumes, then you are going to get your mate. We have audible signals like mating songs, tactile signals like herd interactions, fighting for dominance, electrical such as prey detection, and chemical signals, pheromones, which are going to be signaling things like location, signaling for also reproduction. And when we talk about behaviors, they can be innate or learned. So innate behaviors are developmentally fixed. They're inherited and they're unlearned. They're a reflex, such as the flight or fight response. And what happens to your body during this flight or fight response? You're going to get tunnel vision, accelerated heart rate, blood sugar is going to be turning into glucose. You're going to have more blood sugar, glycogen will be turning into glucose. And so you'll be ready to fight or to flee. This is something that is fixed within your genetic system. But there's also learned behaviors modified based on the environment, based on specific experiences such as imprinting and conditioning. Common example here is Pavlov's dog. Pavlov classically conditioned his dog so that every time he gave it food, he would also ring a bell, and eventually over time the dog would begin to salivate when the bell was rung, even if there was no food present, by beginning to associate the food with the bell. And so this is a conditioning, and it's a learned behavior. It's not something that that the dog was born with, but it was something that Pavlov taught to the dog. And fitness favors behaviors that increase survival and reproductive success. So behaviors that are going to allow you to survive and reproduce, those are the ones that are going to be more commonly displayed. And so we look at cooperative behaviors that are a large example of this, and they tend to increase the fitness of both the organism and the population, and that's why they're so common within nature, because they're not only increasing the fitness, the biological fitness, the chance to reproduce of both the organism, but also of the population. And this includes altruism, which can reduce individual fitness but increases the fitness of others, such as a warning call. So if an animal gives a warning call because a predator is nearby, then the predator may be alerted to the location of that organism, but it's going to save the rest of its population by warning about the predator being there. So that's altruism. We also see kin selection, which provides aid that enables close relatives to produce offspring. And lastly, we look at herd, flock, and schooling behavior. For instance, the school of fish, there is power in numbers, and so these fish are protecting each other by being in a school. Now, organisms need energy to organize, to grow, to reproduce, to stay alive, but also to maintain homeostasis, which is maintaining a stable internal environment. And so one way this happens is through thermoregulation. That's how animals maintain internal temperature. We have endotherms that are warmed by heat generated through metabolism, so through the chemical reactions that the body does. And this is going to be us, humans are endotherms. And after metabolic activity, a lot of energy is lost as heat, and so we're warming ourselves through that metabolic activity. Meanwhile, ectotherms get heat from external sources, such as this iguana tanning itself in the sun in order to warm itself up. It is what you would call a cold-blooded creature. And when you have a net gain in energy, that means you're going to be able to reproduce. You're going to be able to survive. And the reproductive strategy can be different based on the amount of energy available. Some species are able to asexually reproduce when sexual reproduction takes too much energy, because in order to sexually reproduce, you have to find a mate. So asexual reproduction allows for the survival of the genome, even though it may not increase genetic variation. Some species go into reproductive diapause, where they just stop reproducing until there are enough resources, until the environment is stable enough in order to sustain reproduction. And with the net loss in energy, there's going to be less reproduction. There's going to be death. And last thing we're going to look at is metabolic rate here, which is the total energy used by organisms. And smaller animals are going to have a higher metabolic rate because of their higher surface area to volume ratio. So there's going to be more surface area for volume that exists here, and so they're going to be losing heat much faster. It's going to be transferring out of their body, and so they're going to need to gain more energy in order to stay alive, whereas larger animals are not going to need as much energy. They have a smaller surface area to volume ratio. And when we look at organizations of animals, we start from populations, which are same species, individuals that interact. Then we go to communities, multiple species interacting, and then ecosystems, where we have both biotic, living, and abiotic, non-living factors, such as sunlight, such as water, such as rocks. And energy is going to flow through these ecosystems between organisms, and it's initially going to be sourced from the sun. And then it's going to travel to our producers and then later to consumers, and we'll discuss this further on. Meanwhile, matter and nutrients are going to be cycled through biogeochemical cycles. And these nutrients are going to have both abiotic and biotic reservoirs, so where these nutrients are stored, so both in life and not in life, and processes that cycle matter between these reservoirs. And we'll look at all of these cycles in a second. And so we have the law of conservation of mass, the law of conservation of energy, saying that these things cannot be created or destroyed, and they're only transferred from one form to another. Energy is going to be lost as heat, and then more energy will flow through the ecosystem. So it's transformed from solar to chemical to heat energy. And nutrients are just going to be cycled through different forms across Earth. And so we'll be looking at these biogeochemical cycles first. First up, the water cycle. I'm sure you've heard of this. And so the hydrosphere is going to be encompassing all of the water on Earth. So everywhere water is found, that's part of the hydrosphere. And that's going to be sort of the area in which this happens. And water evaporates from oceans and surface water. So oceans and surface water are like this starting reservoir, and it's going to evaporate, meaning the sun is going to heat up the molecules, causing bonds to be broken between liquid water, and that's going to result in gas, water vapor, that's going to be rising up in the air because it's lighter, and so it's going to rise up, and then same thing will happen from plants through transpiration, which is like evaporation from plants. And so once this water vapor rises up and reaches the colder atmosphere, the bonds are going to reform, it's going to condense, and that's going to form clouds, and eventually it's going to precipitate back to sources of water. So we're going from oceans, from surface water into the atmosphere, and then that's going to go back to surface water to oceans. And it'll also go through organisms that intake water for survival and then excrete it. Next, with the carbon cycle, carbon is going to be transferred between the atmosphere and the biosphere, so between the atmosphere and then life. So it's going to be between organisms in the form of carbohydrates and then the atmosphere within carbon dioxide. And as carbon is the basis of life, it's going to be present within life, but it'll also be present within the macromolecules that make up life, and within the atmosphere it's going to be in the form of carbon dioxide gas. And so through photosynthesis it'll be turned into carbohydrates, and then it'll again be released into the atmosphere through cellular respiration. So there's the cycle where these outputs of photosynthesis are feeding the inputs of cellular respiration and vice versa. We have decomposition, where dead organic matter is going to be broken down, releasing these nutrients into the environment, including carbon, and combustion, where a substance reacts with an oxidant, such as oxygen, producing heat and light. So it's mainly the cellular respiration photosynthesis cycle, but also because there is carbon within life, when living organisms, when organic matter dies, it's going to be broken down, and so this carbon will then be released back to the atmosphere as well. Next up, nitrogen cycle. So the largest reservoir of the nitrogen cycle is going to be in the atmosphere. It makes up 70 to 70-something% of air. And so certain bacteria in the soil are first going to fix nitrogen. So through nitrogen fixation, nitrogen gas is going to become ammonia. And then moving through the soil, it'll become ammonium. And ammonia is also converted to nitrate through a process known as nitrification. And so plants are going to get their nutrients from the soil and intake nitrogen in this way, and bacteria will get compounds from the plant, and this is known as assimilation, where these resources are going to be taken up by plants. When organisms die, ammonia is going to be released back into soil. That's known as ammonification, and nitrates will be converted back to nitrogen gas by bacteria, and that's denitrification. So over here we can start with nitrogen gas. Through fixation, it'll become ammonia, and then nitrifying bacteria, nitrification will occur, turning it into nitrate, and then it's going to be assimilated into plants and absorption then through animals who are eating those plants. And once the animals die, the ammonia is released back into soil. We have ammonification, and then denitrification occurs, and the cycle continues. Because of course, these nutrients cannot be created and destroyed, only transferring forms. Last up is the phosphorus cycle, and so we start with weathering rocks. So rocks that are being targeted by erosion, by weathering, they're being chipped away by the weather, maybe strong winds, maybe strong rain. But weathering rocks are going to release phosphate into the soil and into groundwater. And that's going to be taken up by plants and eventually transferred to animals who eat those plants. And then it'll return to the soil through decomposition and excretion. So when these plants and animals die, they'll be decomposed, phosphorus will be returned, but also excretion. And then what's going to happen is they'll be incorporated back into rocks. So the organisms that are cycling all of this matter, all of these nutrients, are either going to be autotrophs or heterotrophs. And autotrophs are the producers in the environment. They're capturing energy from the environment. Mostly we think of plants here, photosynthetic, where energy is going to be captured from the sun. But there are also chemosynthetic organisms, where energy is captured from inorganic molecules, where there's no oxygen, where there is no sunlight. But they are still producers because they're getting energy from the environment. And then that energy will be transferred to heterotrophs, the consumers, which will capture energy in carbon compounds by consuming energy from organic matters in autotrophs. So when they eat the autotrophs, they're going to then get the energy from that. And so they'll be metabolizing carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids in order to gain that energy. And heterotrophs include herbivores, which are plant eaters, omnivores, which eat both meat and plants, carnivores, which are meat eaters, decomposers, which break down organic matter that's dead in order to return it back to the environment, and scavengers, which feed on dead organisms. So last thing for this topic is discussing trophic levels. So we talked about matter cycling, but there's also energy flow. And energy flow occurs through trophic levels, which are going to be levels in a food web. And a food web shows energy relationships between organisms in an ecosystem, essentially who is eating what. And so we're looking at levels in the food web from producers to primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. So over here we have our producers, our plants, and then our primary consumers are going to be rabbit, grasshopper, bees. Those are the ones directly gaining energy from the plants. Secondary consumers are going to be eating the primary consumers, and so forth and so forth. And so when we look at these energy relationships between producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, we look at the 10% rule, where only 10% of the energy is going to be transferred between trophic levels, and the rest will be lost as heat in the metabolic energy transfer. So it's crucial to remember why the producer level is going to be so large on the trophic pyramid, because only 10% of that energy is going to be transferred to the primary consumers. And a change in the number of producers and the change in the amount of sunlight can greatly affect the rest of the trophic levels. Because if you have less sunlight, that means less energy for the producers to work with. And if you have less producers, that means the rest of the trophic levels aren't going to be getting food, because energy will not be moving up the food web. And now we're going to move on to 8.3, discussing population ecology. So a population is a group of individuals of a single species living in the same general area. And population ecology explores factors that influence the size, density, distribution, and age structure of population. So we're looking at demographics. A demographic we can look at is density, which is the number of individuals per unit of volume. And there's different dispersions within a certain area. There can be clumped, uniform, or random dispersion. So I'm going to draw these three dispersions here. First up is going to be random, where individuals are just going to be in random locations throughout the area. This means that the resources that they're using are going to be spread out randomly. That's generally the reason for a random dispersion. When we have a clumped dispersion, everyone is in one area. Either there's going to be some herd behavior that's being seen, for instance, protection of one member of an individual of the population, or there's a single resource, and so all individuals are clumped around that resource. We can also see uniform dispersion, which is very spread out, but also done so in an almost mathematical way, and we can see that either there's enough resources that are evenly spread out across the area, or this is done for a purpose. The individuals of the population are spread out so for a reason. And we also look at survivorship curves, which is going to be the rate of survival over time. And we have three types of survivorship curves here. We have type 1, which is long life, meaning there's going to be a lot of individuals up until a certain age that are going to be surviving. So within humans, generally, if you're surviving for a long time, and then at a certain point, that's going to be the age limit. People are going to begin passing away, and so the amount of individuals will be declining. But for the majority of your life, or for the first period of time within the life, there's going to be a lot of individuals at that level. Then type 2 are going to be preyed upon consistently throughout their life. So there's going to be a steady decline. So there's not going to be a specific moment in time where there could be more individuals of the population than other times. They're preyed upon consistently throughout a lifetime. And type 3 is like the survivor curve. There's a very low chance of making it into adulthood, of making it into maturity. But once that happens, then there's going to be a long life. So there aren't very many individuals that are going to be making it past a certain age. But once individuals do make it past that age, then they are going to be able to survive for much longer. And we also look at age structure pyramids, which is the relative number of individuals of each age in a population. And so we look at the rate of population growth. So when there's rapid growth, there's going to be a lot of youth in the population. When there's slow growth, there's going to be a bit of a balance. So there's going to be like middle-aged individuals and youth, and they'll be balanced out. But with no growth, we're seeing a shift towards older members of the generation making up more of the population. And that's a genuine problem when there aren't enough youth in order to keep society running, in order to take care of all of the elders within the society. So now that we've discussed these different demographics, we can look at population growth. So population growth over time is going to be the individuals born minus the individuals that died, and usually measured in years. And population is going to grow when the birth rate is larger than the death rate, when you have more people born than dying. And so when there are abundant resources, there are ideal conditions, a population can grow as much as it wants to. We see exponential population growth, where we can look at this curve. It's called a J curve because it slopes up like a J. We see over time there's going to be a lot of growth, and as the population gets larger, it's going to grow even faster because more and more people are more and more individuals are reproducing. And so we can look at this population growth equation. The change in population size, dn, over change in time, dt, is going to be the birth rate minus the death rate. So p amount born minus amount that died. And when we look at exponential growth, that's going to be our growth rate times the current population size. So if we want to find the growth rate and the population after one generation, and our initial population is 500 individuals, we have 100 births and 40 deaths, and the rate is going to be 0.12, we can use these equations in order to find population growth. So first, if we just think about it logically, after one generation, if we have 100 births and 40 deaths, that means that there are going to be 60 overall increase. So there's going to be an increase of overall 60 individuals in the population. If we want to do this calculation using our exponential growth function, dn over dt, if our growth rate is 12 and our initial population is 500, we can multiply it out to also get 60. So over one generation, the population has changed by 60 individuals. 60 individuals were added to the population. And if we didn't know the growth rate at the beginning, but we wanted to calculate it, we could find the birth rate and death rate by figuring out how many births out of the total population, how many deaths out of the total population. So if we have, for birth rate, that's going to be 100 births for out of these 500 people, there's going to be 100 births, and so our birth rate is 1/5 or 0.20. Death rate is going to be 40 for the total population, and that's going to be 0.08 when it's divided out. And so if we subtract the birth minus the death rate, we can see that our growth rate is going to be 0.12. That is how much the population is going to be changing per generation. However, when we look at exponential population growth, that means resources are abundant, and this is not possible for a long time because environments have a certain limit onto how many individuals they can hold, and that is the carrying capacity, the maximum population size that a certain environment can support at a particular time. And so we see logistic population growth where the rate of growth is going to decline as the carrying capacity is reached. As resources are running out, the amount of growth in the population is going to decrease. So if we look at our logistic growth curve, it's called an S curve, and here's our carrying capacity K, we see that growth is slowing down as we approach carrying capacity. And so the formula here is going to be dn over dt, so change in population size over change in time, is equal to our growth rate times initial population, so just like our exponential growth function, but we also have to account for carrying capacity. So we have to take carrying capacity minus population size over carrying capacity is going to be multiplied by our initial population size and our growth rate in order to get our logistic growth. And so this is going to affect reproduction, such as life history. So that's when you reproduce, how many times you reproduce. During each reproductive cycle, how many offspring are there? And so in an environment where there are going to be a lot of resources available, then there's more reproduction occurring. And so this is greatly affecting life history. So for instance, if we're calculating logistic growth here, if we have a rate of 1, a population of 1,300, and a carrying capacity of 1,600, let's calculate logistical growth. So dn over dt is going to be 1 times initial population, 1,300. Then we have k minus n, that's going to be 1,600 minus 1,300 is 300, and then over k, which is 1,600. And then we can multiply all of these out in order to get 243.75. So obviously we can't add 243.75 individuals, so we can round it up to 244, but that is going to be by how many individuals the population is going to change when we have this carrying capacity of 1,600 individuals. And as the population size approaches the carrying capacity, the amount that the population will grow, is going to diminish. And so what are the reasons behind the carrying capacity existing. What is preventing infinite population growth? And we see density-dependent factors, density-dependent limiting factors. When there's a higher population density, so individuals per unit of area, so more individuals clumped in one area, the death rate will increase or the birth rate will decrease due to these factors, such as competition for resources, for food, for space, territoriality and nesting. Disease is going to be able to transmit easier in a clumped area, and it's much easier to find prey if all the individuals are in one space. And so when the population gets too high, these factors are going to cause it to shrink. And these are going to be the reasons that and the factors that contribute to the carrying capacity for that environment. There are also density independent factors where the death rate will change regardless of a change in population density. These are natural disasters, these are human involvement. They're going to kill off members of the population, they're going to remove habitat, but it's not due to too many individuals in the population, it's just due to this natural occurrence, due to human involvement that's going to be interfering with the growth of the population. Moving on, we've got community ecology. So we talked about populations, now we're discussing communities. And a community is a group of populations of different species living close enough to each other to interact. And so we see interspecific interaction between different species. And they can be positive, can be negative, and can be neutral. And over time, they're going to cause the community to change. And interactions determine how each species accesses energy and resources as these species learn to coexist, and as natural selection is going to, and biological fitness is going to favor behaviors that allow all of these individuals to survive and reproduce. So we can look at symbiosis, which are close and long-term relationships between two species, and we see parasitism, where one species is benefiting and the other one is losing out. One species, the parasite, is going to get nourishment from the host, which is harmed in the process. For instance, mosquitoes, they're taking our blood and they're leaving behind itchiness. And so they are going to be a parasite, and they could even leave disease. We see mutualism where both species are benefiting. Both species are going to benefit from the relationship, like this clownfish and anemone. Clownfish are going to find shelter and protection within the stinging tentacles of the anemone, while the anemone benefits from the clownfish's presence by being cleaned of parasites and attracting prey. And we also see commensalism, where one species is benefiting, but the other one, it's a neutral effect. It's not harming, but it's not benefiting the species either. And so we look at barnacles and whales. These barnacles are getting a ride, they're getting food, but it's no detriment to the whale. The whale does not care. And so we can measure the diversity of a community using Simpson's diversity index. And diversity is going to be how many species are there within this community, and also how many members of each species. Because if you have a well-balanced number, if there's, for instance, 4 species and each species has 10 members within the community, that means there's a higher chance that all of these species are going to survive than if there were 30 members of one and 10 of the other species. So Simpson's diversity index is going to count for the species richness, so the number of species within the community, but also the relative abundance, the percentage each species makes up of the total community. And when we have a more diverse community, so a higher Simpson's diversity index number, that means it's going to be more stable, it's going to have greater productivity, and it's going to have more species that have different niches, so more species that have different roles within the community, and so there's going to be less competition between species. And so calculating Simpson's diversity index, we take 1 minus the sum of, that's what this sigma sum notation means here. We're adding up all of the values here. Total number of organisms of a particular species divided by total number of organisms of all species squared. So we'll practice right here by finding the diversity. Species A has 10 people, species B has 15 individuals, species C has 35 individuals, and species D has 40 individuals. So first of all, we got to find the total number of organisms of all species. So adding up all of these individuals gets to 100 individuals. Then we find the diversity. That's going to be 1 minus the sum of, we have 10 over 100 squared plus 15 over 100 squared plus 35 over 100 squared plus 40 over 100 squared. And then you do that in the calculator, you do your mental math, and you get 1 minus 0.315 or 0.685. So this is going to be a relatively diverse community because it's going to be measured, this diversity index, from 0 to 1. And so we're past the halfway threshold. This is going to be on the more diverse side for communities. And like I discussed on the last slide, there is competition between different species when resources are in short supply. And that's not beneficial to either species because they have to now fight for these resources. And generally, the less reproductively advantaged species could be eliminated as a result. This is competitive exclusion. The one that's a little worse adapted to the environment is the one that's not going to get this resource and survive. And so we look at niches here and niche partitioning. The ecological niche is the sum of biotic and abiotic resources a species use. So sum of living and non-living resources the species use. And so they're both fundamental and realized niches. So the niche that the species could occupy and the niche that the species actually does occupy. And natural selection favors behaviors that lessen this competition. So there's going to be niche partitioning, where these species are going to all move to their realized niches in order to not impede on each other's territory, because this is going to be the niche that they can live within. It might not be their maximum niche, their fundamental niche, but they're able to survive and reproduce within their realized niche, and that's going to prevent competition. And similar species are able to that way split up resources. So over here we see the Kthamalus fundamental niche can go on the shore and also in the ocean. However, it's actually going to be in its realized niche of the shore, because the Balanus also has its realized niche within the ocean and partly up the shore. And what this means is both of these species will be able to get the resources that they need without competition, because they're both within their realized niches, rather than Kthamalus being within the fundamental niche and then Balanus not being able to get the resources that it needs. So we've got predation and trophic cascades now, another interspecific interaction. And so predation is going to be positive for one species and negative for the other species. One species is going to kill and eat the other, predator and prey. And we also see herbivory, where the organism is going to eat the plant. And prey has developed adaptations in order to avoid predation, such as camouflage, where we're going to be hiding, warning colors saying, "Don't eat me, I'm poisonous." And mimicry, where we are not poisonous, but we have warning colors that show that we are. And so there's also going to be predator-prey cycles that have developed, which are going to regulate the sizes of both species. For instance, over here we see our rabbit, the prey, and our predator, the fox. And as the rabbit population is going to grow, the foxes are going to be eating good, and they're going to be growing as well because there are more rabbits to eat. But because of that eating of the rabbit population size is going to decline. And so then the fox population will also decline because there's less prey. And in this way, these oscillations are going to regulate the size of both species. We also see trophic cascades, where changes in one level of a food web can affect other levels. So if we see over here our producers, our primary consumers, and secondary consumer, the big bad wolf, if the big bad wolf was eliminated from this community, from this food web, then that means there's nothing stopping the primary producers from eating all the plants. And as a result, there are the primary consumers from eating all the plants. Apologies. And so there are going to be less producers now, and that's eventually going to lead to the primary consumers dying off unless they can find another resource. So predation regulates the size of the populations all throughout trophic levels, and changes in one level of a food web can affect other levels because of predation. And when we look at biodiversity, which is the variety of living things and life processes within a population, community, or ecosystem, we see that more diversity leads to more resilience, more adaptability to changes, and a more diverse ecosystem that has lots of different species in it, that has lots of individuals of each species, has a higher chance of there being an individual, a population that can survive and adapt and reproduce within an environmental change. And there are key elements of an ecosystem that without it, the ecosystem cannot exist, such as vital abiotic factors, including water. Producers are a must. Without them, there's no energy passed on to higher trophic levels, and energy cannot pass on to primary consumers, secondary consumers. They're the dominant species that are going to be the most abundant in the community, and so they can exhibit more resilience when the environment changes because there's more variation within the species, as there are already going to be more individuals of that species. And lastly, the most important, we have our keystone species. They're not abundant, but they're going to exert control over the community structure. based on their role within the ecosystem. And when removed, the community is going to collapse. And that's why they're named keystone species. If the keystone piece of the arch is removed, the entire arch collapses. And one of the very famous keystone species are sea otters. And sea otters feed on sea urchins, which feed on kelp. And when otters were killed off, almost killed off, to gain their fur, to gain their pelts, there was nothing regulating the sea urchin population, and so all the kelp also died out. And so without the sea otters, the entire ecosystem collapsed. The otters were the keystone species. Lastly, we have dangers and disruptions to ecosystems. Organisms are well adapted to their environments, but if the environment suddenly changes, then now it's going to be a lot more difficult for these populations and species to survive. So dangers to ecosystems include invasive species, non-native species that when introduced to a new environment cause harm to the environment because they're exploiting a new niche. They don't have any predators because they're new to this environment. They can outcompete native species again because they're not living within this environment. They're new to it, and so they have a new role within the environment that allows them to get the resources they need, but potentially not native species to get the resources that these native species need. So we can look at the kudzu plant, which is native to East Asia, but it's become a problem in the US because it was introduced in the late 19th century for erosion control and as a forage crop, but its rapid growth and ability to smother other vegetation made it a major ecological pest. And so humans have often contributed to disruptions to ecosystems, and one example is through invasive species. We also see global climate change, another largely human-caused factor of disruption to ecosystems, where change in the global climate, namely warming, is going to lead to weather and habitat changes, and we can see that ice is going to be broken up, and so now animals that live on the ice are going to be losing their habitats. There's habitat fragmentation. We see geological and meteorological events that are not human caused, such as El Nino, which are going to be a consistent weather pattern. Continental drift, with the continents moving apart from each other a few inches each year. That's going to be obviously a slow change in ecosystems, but as continents move, environments are going to change. And we also see the meteor impact on dinosaurs so many years ago that just completely wiped out the dinosaur population. So geological and meteorological events, even though they're not human caused, they are disruptions to ecosystems. Lastly, we have habitat loss, where habitats are destroyed due to logging, due to urbanization, in order to take out a diverse ecosystem and replace it with a single crop for growth, and fragmenting habitats. These are going to destroy habitats, and they're going to replace them with less biodiverse ecosystems that are not going to be so resilient to change. And so these disruptions that human activities can cause can also lead to extinction. And some disruptions that humans have caused specifically include transmission of infection across the Atlantic by humans has resulted in Dutch elm disease in America and potato blight in Europe. So the transfer of these diseases by humans moving across the Atlantic has resulted in these diseases being introduced. We see biomagnification, which are toxins that cannot be broken down biologically, becoming more concentrated in successive trophic levels, such as DDT. So when plants are sprayed with pesticides and those plants are eaten by the primary consumers, and then those primary consumers are eaten by secondary consumers, these secondary consumers are eventually going to be having a lot of the DDT within their body, because each primary consumer needs to eat a lot of plants to survive, and each secondary consumer needs to eat a lot of primary consumers to survive, because as you recall, there's only a 10% energy transfer between trophic levels. So what's going to happen is there's going to be a high concentration of these toxins that cannot be broken down biologically that are going to be concentrated within these secondary consumers, these tertiary consumers. And we also see eutrophication, where water bodies become excessively enriched with nutrients, leading to harmful algal blooms and oxygen depleting, harming aquatic life. And these are accelerated by agricultural runoff. So when we have agriculture and when we have fertilizers on these farms, and then it rains and there's runoff, so these nutrients are going to be leaving the farms and going with water and eventually running off into large bodies of water. That's going to lead to algal blooms that are now having a lot of nutrients, and so the population is going to be reproducing a lot. And so these algal blooms are going to block sunlight. It's going to result in oxygen depletion, and aquatic life will be harmed. And all of these are human activities that are disrupting the environment and can contribute and potentially cause extinction within ecosystems. So that was Unit 8. And now with this, we have completed all of AP Bio. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next course.